The region now called New York encompasses approximately 54,000 square miles of terrain shaped by glacial retreat beginning around 13,000 years ago. This retreat left a landscape of river valleys, interior highlands, coastal plains, and glacial lakes that created diverse ecological zones. The Hudson River corridor connected upland forests to the Atlantic coast. The Finger Lakes region offered concentrated freshwater resources. Long Island's terminal moraine provided access to marine environments. These environmental variations influenced where prehistoric populations settled, what resources they exploited, and how they moved across the terrain. The archaeological record remains incomplete. Site preservation varies significantly between well-drained uplands and eroded coastlines. Organic materials rarely survive in acidic northeastern soils. Many early sites lie beneath modern development or were destroyed by subsequent glacial activity. Researchers estimate that thousands of years of human activity left scattered evidence across the region, but only a fraction has been systematically investigated. The environmental framework of prehistoric New York emerged from processes set in motion during the last glacial maximum. The Laurentide ice sheet covered the entire region until approximately 15,000 years ago. As temperatures warmed, ice retreated northward, leaving behind sculpted bedrock, till deposits, and glacial erratics scattered across the landscape. Meltwater created extensive lake systems and carved river channels that would define drainage patterns for millennia. The Hudson River Valley formed a major north-south corridor extending from the Adirondack Highlands to the Atlantic Ocean. This waterway connected interior resources to coastal zones and provided migration routes for fish species, including shad, sturgeon, and striped bass. Tributaries such as the Mohawk River extended access westward toward the Great Lakes region. The Delaware River system drained the southern portions of the region, creating additional travel and settlement corridors. The Finger Lakes emerged as long, narrow bodies of water oriented north to south, carved by glacial action through sedimentary bedrock. These lakes included Cayuga, Seneca, Keuka, Canandaigua, and others, each providing reliable freshwater sources and concentrating aquatic resources. The surrounding hills offered diverse elevations and microclimates. Lake effect weather patterns created localized precipitation zones that influenced vegetation distribution. The lakes themselves served as focal points for seasonal settlements and travel routes between upland hunting territories and lowland agricultural zones in later periods. Long Island's formation resulted from the deposition of terminal moraine material as glaciers advanced and retreated. The Harbor Hill and Ronkonkoma moraines created the island's backbone, running east-west along its length. South of these ridges, outwash plains sloped gently toward the Atlantic coast, creating sandy soils with different drainage characteristics than mainland areas. The northern shore faced Long Island Sound, a drowned river valley that formed as sea levels rose following deglaciation. This protected water body provided access to estuarine resources distinct from the open Atlantic environment to the south. Climate during the immediate post-glacial period differed substantially from modern conditions. Tundra vegetation initially dominated recently deglaciated terrain. Spruce and pine forests gradually replaced tundra as temperatures continued warming. By approximately 10,000 years ago, mixed deciduous forests containing oak, hickory, chestnut, and other hardwoods began expanding across lower elevations. These forests provided nuts, fruits, and browse that supported diverse animal populations. White-tailed deer, elk, and smaller mammals became increasingly abundant as forest ecosystems matured. The transition from spruce-dominated forests to hardwood-dominated forests represented a fundamental shift in available plant and animal resources. Coastal environments changed dramatically as post-glacial sea level rise continued for thousands of years. Early coastal settlements now lie submerged beneath modern sea level. The Atlantic coastline migrated inland over time, drowning river mouths and creating extensive salt marsh and estuarine habitats. These environments supported shellfish beds, migratory waterfowl, and marine fish populations. The specific configuration of bays, inlets, and barrier islands shifted continuously as sea levels stabilized around 3,000 years ago. Prior to stabilization, coastal settlements required adaptation to changing shoreline positions and resource availability. The Adirondack Highlands represented a distinct environmental zone characterized by thin soils, exposed bedrock, and extended winter conditions. Elevations exceeding 4,000 feet created boreal forest conditions with spruce, fir, and paper birch. These uplands drained into numerous streams and rivers that flowed toward the St. Lawrence lowlands to the north and the Hudson Valley to the south. The region contained limited areas suitable for intensive occupation, but offered seasonal hunting opportunities and access to specific lithic resources. High-elevation zones remained marginal for most prehistoric subsistence strategies. The Mohawk River Valley created a natural transportation corridor extending east to west across the region. This valley provided access to extensive wetland complexes, productive floodplain soils, and connections to both the Hudson drainage and the Great Lakes watershed. The valley's relatively low elevation and gentle gradient made it a preferred travel route. Multiple tributaries provided access to upland hunting territories and lithic source areas. The concentration of later prehistoric village sites in the Mohawk Valley reflects its environmental advantages for both agriculture and transportation. Precipitation patterns across the region varied with topography and proximity to large water bodies. Lake-effect snow in areas downwind of the Great Lakes and the Finger Lakes created deep winter snowpack that influenced seasonal mobility strategies. Coastal areas received less snowfall but experienced nor'easter storm systems, bringing heavy precipitation and storm surge. Interior highlands received intermediate precipitation, but experienced longer periods of frozen ground and limited growing seasons. These climatic variations created distinct adaptive challenges for human populations across different portions of the region. Wetland environments developed extensively in low-lying areas with poor drainage. Glacial kettle ponds formed where ice blocks melted beneath till deposits. Beaver activity created and maintained additional wetland habitats. These environments provided seasonal concentrations of waterfowl, fish, and plant resources, including cattails and wild rice. Wetlands also influenced travel routes by creating obstacles to overland movement, while simultaneously providing canoe routes during ice-free seasons. The dynamic nature of wetland habitats required detailed knowledge of seasonal flooding patterns and resource availability. Stone tool material sources distributed unevenly across the landscape influenced settlement patterns and trade networks. High-quality cherts occurred in specific bedrock formations in central and western portions of the region. Rhyolite sources existed in the Hudson Highlands. Coastal areas lacked local high-quality lithic materials, necessitating trade or direct procurement from interior sources. The distribution of lithic materials in archaeological sites reflects both local availability and long-distance exchange relationships. Distinctive raw materials allow researchers to track movement of finished tools and raw materials across the region. Soil quality varied significantly based on parent material and topographic position. Floodplain soils along major rivers offered fertility suitable for later agricultural practices. Glacial till produced variable soil quality depending on clay and organic content. Sandy outwash deposits drained rapidly and offered limited agricultural potential. Upland soils derived from weathered bedrock varied by underlying geology. These soil differences became increasingly important as populations adopted cultivated crops during late prehistoric periods. Earlier populations focused less on soil quality and more on proximity to diverse wild resources. The earliest confirmed human presence in New York dates to approximately 11,000 BCE, associated with Paleo-Indian groups identified primarily through distinctive fluted projectile points. These points, including Clovis and later variants, appear across the region in varying concentrations. The distribution of finds suggests mobile populations exploiting multiple environmental zones rather than permanent settlements in any single location. Site density remains low compared to later periods, indicating either sparse populations or poor preservation of early sites. Researchers debate whether low site counts reflect actual population levels or result from taphonomic processes that destroyed or buried early evidence. Clovis points have been recovered from scattered locations across New York, typically as isolated surface finds rather than intact archaeological sites. These lanceolate bifaces with characteristic basal flutes appear in upland contexts, river valleys, and occasionally near former glacial lake margins. The scarcity of associated cultural material limits interpretation of Clovis settlement patterns and subsistence practices. Some researchers suggest these populations hunted large game, including caribou and possibly mastodons, though direct evidence of megafaunal hunting in the region remains limited. Others propose more generalized subsistence strategies, incorporating diverse plant and animal resources. The temporal relationship between Clovis occupation and terminal Pleistocene megafaunal extinction complicates interpretation of Paleo-Indian lifeways. Mastodon remains have been found in New York at sites dating to the terminal Pleistocene, but clear association between human activity and extinct megafauna remains elusive. Most mastodon finds lack evidence of human modification. The extent to which Paleo-Indian groups in the region relied on megafaunal hunting versus caribou, deer, and smaller mammals remains debated. Environmental conditions during this period differed substantially from later Holocene conditions, with open parkland and spruce forests supporting different animal communities than subsequent hardwood forests. Post-Clovis Paleo-Indian manifestations include several point types that appear chronologically and morphologically distinct from Clovis technology. These include Gainey, Barnes, Crowfield, and Holcomb point types, each showing variations in fluting technique, overall shape, and size. The proliferation of named types may reflect temporal changes in technology, regional stylistic preferences, or functional variations for different hunting applications. Archaeologists debate whether type variations represent distinct cultural groups or represent technological evolution within continuous populations. The temporal resolution of radiocarbon dating for this period often cannot distinguish between competing hypotheses. The distribution of Paleo-Indian points shows concentrations in specific areas that may reflect preferential use of certain environmental zones. The Hudson Valley and major tributaries contain numerous finds, suggesting these corridors served as important travel routes and settlement areas. The Finger Lakes region has yielded multiple Paleo-Indian points, potentially reflecting the concentration of resources around stable freshwater sources. Long Island and coastal areas show lower densities of Paleo-Indian material, though this pattern may result from sea level rise submerging early coastal sites rather than absence of occupation. Intact Paleo-Indian sites with preserved stratigraphy and feature contexts remain rare. The Kings Road site in Jefferson County provided evidence of tool manufacturing activities, including channel flakes characteristic of fluted point production. The Duchess Quarry Caves in Orange County contained stratified deposits with extinct fauna and possible human modification, though the association remains controversial. The West Athens Hill site in Greene County yielded Clovis points in context with later materials, but disturbance limits interpretation. The scarcity of undisturbed Paleo-Indian sites reflects both the age of deposits and subsequent landscape modifications that destroyed or obscured early evidence. Lithic raw material used for Paleo-Indian tools indicates both local procurement and long-distance movement of materials. High-quality cherts from sources in Pennsylvania and Ohio appear in New York Paleo-Indian assemblages, suggesting either direct procurement over long distances or exchange networks connecting regions. Some Paleo-Indian points in the region used local materials, including Hudson Valley rhyolite and cherts from central New York sources. The mixture of local and exotic materials suggests mobility patterns that encompassed territories of several hundred kilometers or participation in exchange systems linking distant regions. Tool technology during the Paleo-Indian period emphasized bifacial reduction strategies, producing highly curated implements. Fluted points required substantial skill to manufacture and represent significant investment of time and material. Associated tool forms include end scrapers, gravers, and utilized flakes. The relatively small number of tool types compared to later periods may reflect specialized subsistence strategies, or simply the limited archaeological sample. Paleo-Indian groups demonstrated sophisticated stoneworking knowledge, including understanding of fracture mechanics and heat treatment to improve workability of lithic materials. Settlement patterns during the Paleo-Indian period appear highly mobile based on the distribution of find locations and low artifact densities at individual sites. Researchers suggest seasonal rounds that moved populations between resource zones following caribou migrations, fish runs, or other concentrated resources. Base camps likely existed, but remain archaeologically invisible or unrecognized. Short-term hunting stations and lithic procurement sites represent the most common site types identified. The lack of features such as hearths, storage pits, or substantial structural remains at most sites suggests brief occupation episodes rather than extended stays. Climate during the Paleo-Indian period transitioned from late glacial to early Holocene conditions. Spruce parkland gradually gave way to pine and then mixed hardwood forests. Temperature fluctuations during this transition period may have created unstable resource distributions requiring adaptive flexibility. The Younger Dryas cooling event between approximately 10,800 and 9,500 BCE temporarily reversed warming trends and may have influenced human settlement strategies. Evidence for how Paleo-Indian populations in New York responded to this climatic reversal remains unclear due to limited temporal resolution in the archaeological record. Population estimates for Paleo-Indian groups remain highly speculative given the fragmentary nature of evidence. Some researchers propose extremely low population densities across the Northeast during this period, perhaps measured in hundreds rather than thousands of individuals across the entire region. Others suggest higher populations based on the geographic distribution of finds and comparison with ethnographically documented hunter-gatherer population densities. The archaeological record cannot currently resolve these competing estimates. Social organization likely involved small bands of related individuals moving across large territories, though the specific composition and size of social units remains unknown. The transition from Paleo-Indian to subsequent Archaic period traditions occurred gradually rather than abruptly. Changes in projectile point styles, site distributions, and subsistence evidence suggest evolving adaptations to changing environmental conditions as forests matured and megafaunal populations disappeared. Whether these changes represent cultural continuity within evolving populations or replacement by new groups entering the region remains debated. Genetic evidence is lacking for Paleo-Indian populations in New York. Archaeological evidence alone cannot distinguish between scenarios of population continuity, replacement, or admixture during this transitional period. The Archaic period in New York spans roughly 8,000 years, from approximately 8,000 BCE to 1,000 BCE, encompassing profound environmental and cultural changes. Archaeologists divide this extended period into early, middle, and late Archaic phases, based on changing projectile point styles, subsistence patterns, and settlement distributions. The Archaic represents a fundamental shift from the mobile hunting adaptations of the Paleo-Indian period toward more regionally specific resource exploitation strategies. Site densities increase substantially compared to earlier periods, indicating either population growth or improved archaeological visibility of later materials. Early Archaic manifestations from approximately 8,000 to 6,000 BCE show continued emphasis on mobility, but with evidence of diversifying subsistence practices. Projectile point forms become more varied, including bifurcate base, corner-notched, and side-notched varieties that differ from Paleo-Indian lanceolate forms. These changes may reflect adaptations to hunting white-tailed deer and other forest-adapted species, rather than caribou or other open-environment game. Groundstone tools, including axes and adzes, appear during this period, indicating woodworking activities associated with forest exploitation. The presence of these tools suggests construction of wooden implements, shelters, or watercraft not preserved in the archaeological record. Early Archaic sites cluster along major river valleys and near freshwater sources, suggesting continued importance of linear travel corridors and access to aquatic resources. The West Athens Hill site in the Hudson Valley contained early Archaic components with diverse tool types, including projectile points, scrapers, and groundstone implements. The Lamoka Lake site, though primarily later, contained early Archaic materials in lower strata. These sites demonstrate repeated occupation of advantageous locations across multiple time periods. Artifact densities at early Archaic sites remain relatively low, suggesting brief occupation episodes rather than extended residential stays. Climate during the early Archaic continued warming trends initiated in the terminal Pleistocene. By 8,000 BCE, pine forests dominated much of the region. Increasing temperatures facilitated northward expansion of oak, hickory, and other mast-producing hardwoods. This transition fundamentally altered available plant resources, with nut crops becoming increasingly important food sources. White-tailed deer populations expanded as forest understory vegetation increased. The shift from coniferous to deciduous forests required corresponding changes in human subsistence strategies and seasonal scheduling to exploit new resource distributions. Middle Archaic period from approximately 6,000 to 4,000 BCE shows intensified use of diverse environmental zones and increased evidence of long-distance exchange networks. Projectile point forms include Neville, Stark, and bifurcate varieties showing regional stylistic variations. Groundstone tool production increased, with axes, adzes, and grinding implements becoming more common. The appearance of atlatl weights or banner stones suggests specialized hunting technology for throwing spears at forest game. These carefully crafted groundstone objects demonstrate investment in hunting equipment and possibly social display functions beyond purely utilitarian purposes. Subsistence evidence from Middle Archaic sites indicates exploitation of deer, fish, nuts, and diverse plant resources. Fishing technology appears to have intensified based on increased fishbone recovery at sites near productive fishing locations. Nut processing became increasingly important as oak hickory forests matured. The labor requirements for nut collection, processing, and storage influenced seasonal settlement patterns. Fall nut harvests likely concentrated populations at specific locations with reliable mast production. Winter dispersal into smaller foraging groups probably followed harvest seasons. The emergence of formal cemeteries during the Middle Archaic represents a significant shift in mortuary practices and possibly territorial organization. These burial grounds suggest repeated use of specific locations over extended periods and potential claims to territory through ancestor association. The Frontenac Island site in Cayuga County contained numerous burials with grave goods, including ground stone tools, bone implements, and copper artifacts. The presence of copper from Lake Superior sources indicates participation in long-distance exchange networks spanning hundreds of kilometers. Marine shell from Atlantic and Gulf coasts also appears in Middle Archaic burial contexts, demonstrating extensive trade connections. Settlement patterns during the Middle Archaic suggest seasonal mobility between different resource zones combined with repeated occupation of favored locations. Base camps near productive fishing locations or reliable nut-producing forests served as residential sites during resource abundance. Smaller extraction camps distributed across the landscape reflect procurement of specific resources, including lithic materials, plant foods, and game. The archaeological signature of this settlement system includes large multi-component sites at optimal locations interspersed with numerous small special-purpose sites across diverse environmental settings. Late Archaic period, from approximately 4000 to 1000 BCE, demonstrates continued intensification of resource exploitation and increasing regional differentiation. The Laurentian tradition in northern and central New York featured ground stone tools, including distinctive gouges, adzes, and ulis, or semi-lunar knives. The Lamoka phase in the Finger Lakes region showed specialized adaptations to lacustrine environments with extensive fishing and aquatic resource exploitation. The Susquehanna tradition in southern portions of the region emphasized broad-bladed projectile points and different settlement patterns reflecting varied environmental conditions. The Lamoka Lake site provided extensive evidence for late archaic lifeways in the Finger Lakes region. Excavations revealed substantial occupation deposits containing thousands of artifacts, including bone tools, antler implements, and stone projectile points. Fish remains dominated faunal assemblages, with evidence of processing and possibly storage. Botanical remains included hickory nuts, acorns, and diverse wild plant seeds. The site's location on a narrow isthmus between two lakes provided access to aquatic resources while maintaining proximity to upland hunting territories. Occupation appears to have been seasonal rather than year-round, based on faunal evidence indicating warm season exploitation. Coastal adaptations during the late Archaic remain poorly understood due to sea level rise submerging early shoreline sites. The Orient phase on Long Island dating to the terminal late Archaic shows intensive shellfish exploitation and marine resource use. Oyster, clam, and other shellfish remains dominate some coastal sites. Swordfish bones at Orient sites indicate offshore fishing capabilities requiring substantial watercraft. The development of specialized marine adaptations on Long Island contrasts with interior riverine and lacustrine strategies, demonstrating regional differentiation in subsistence practices. Soapstone or steatite bowl production began during the terminal late Archaic period. Quarries in Connecticut and Massachusetts supplied raw material that was carved into cooking vessels. These containers appear in New York sites, indicating trade relationships or direct procurement from quarry sources. Soapstone vessels allowed direct heat cooking methods not possible with organic containers. The adoption of this technology preceded ceramic pottery production by several centuries. Soapstone vessel fragments at sites indicate long-distance movement of finished objects or raw material blanks, subsequently modified at residential locations. Population levels during the late Archaic appear substantially higher than earlier periods based on increased site densities and artifact accumulations at major occupation sites. Estimates remain imprecise, but some researchers suggest populations measured in thousands rather than hundreds across the region. Social organization likely involved bands of 25 to 50 individuals, occupying seasonal base camps with periodic aggregation of multiple bands at particularly productive locations during resource abundance. Evidence of conflict remains limited during the Archaic period, with few skeletal indicators of trauma beyond what might result from accidents. Technological innovations during the late Archaic included refinement of ground stone tools, specialized fishing equipment, and development of fiber technologies inferred from indirect evidence. Net weights or plummets suggest net fishing. Bonefish hooks and harpoons indicate diverse fishing strategies. Groundstone pestles and mortars for plant processing become increasingly common. The diversity of tool forms reflects specialized task performance rather than generalized multi-purpose implements. This technological elaboration corresponds with intensified resource exploitation and potentially increased sedentism at favored locations. Exchange networks during the late Archaic connected New York populations to distant regions. Marine shell from Atlantic coastal sources moved inland. Copper from Lake Superior sources appears in burial and domestic contexts. High-quality lithic materials moved across regional boundaries. The mechanisms of exchange remain unclear, but possibilities include direct procurement during seasonal movements, down-the-line trade between neighboring groups, or specialized trading expeditions. The presence of exotic materials at sites demonstrates social networks extending well beyond local territories and suggests information exchange accompanied material movements. Coastal resource exploitation intensified during the late prehistoric period as populations developed specialized strategies for harvesting marine and estuarine resources. Archaeological evidence from Long Island and the lower Hudson Valley indicates systematic shellfish collection, fishing, and seasonal use of coastal zones. The specific timing of coastal intensification remains debated due to submergence of earlier shoreline sites beneath rising sea levels. Sites dating after approximately 3000 BCE show clear evidence of substantial shellfish harvesting, though earlier coastal adaptations likely existed at now submerged locations. Shellfish middens accumulated at locations with access to productive oyster beds, clam flats, and mussel colonies. These deposits contain dense concentrations of shell valves interspersed with stone tools, bone implements, fire-cracked rock, and occasional faunal remains. The size and depth of some middens indicate repeated occupation over extended periods. Seasonal indicators from shell growth patterns and migratory bird remains suggest many coastal sites experienced primary use during warmer months. Winter occupation of exposed coastal locations would have presented challenges from storm systems and reduced resource availability. Oyster harvesting required detailed knowledge of bed locations, tidal cycles, and seasonal reproduction patterns. Productive beds occurred in estuarine environments where freshwater rivers met saltwater, creating optimal salinity conditions. Overharvesting could deplete local beds, necessitating resource management strategies or shifts to alternative locations. The labor investment in shellfish collection remained relatively low compared to many terrestrial resources, making shellfish an attractive food source despite lower caloric returns per unit weight than nuts or large game. Hard clams or quahogs provided both food and raw material for tool and ornament production. Shell columella were fashioned into beads, pendants, and wampum in later periods. The production of shell beads required specialized tools and considerable skill to drill and shape the hard material. Broken or discarded beads at coastal sites indicate local manufacturing rather than exclusive trade acquisition of finished objects. The distribution of marine shell beads at interior sites demonstrates exchange relationships linking coastal and inland populations. Fishing in coastal waters employed diverse technologies suited to different target species and environmental conditions. Weirs or fish traps constructed from wooden stakes and woven materials Captured fish during tidal movements. Net fishing, using weights to sink nets, allowed capture of schooling species. Hook and line fishing targeted larger individual fish, including striped bass and bluefish. Harpoons or Leicesters speared fish in shallow water. The variety of fishing technologies indicates sophisticated understanding of fish behavior and habitat preferences. Swordfish remains at some Long Island sites demonstrate offshore fishing capabilities, requiring substantial watercraft and navigation skills. Swordfish do not approach shorelines and must be pursued in open ocean conditions. The presence of swordfish bones indicates either direct offshore hunting or acquisition through trade with groups possessing ocean-going vessels. Other deepwater species, including cod and shark, also appear in coastal assemblages, though in lower frequencies than inshore species like striped bass and flounder. Seasonal movements between coastal and interior zones allowed exploitation of resources available at different times and locations. Coastal populations likely moved inland during winter months to access deer hunting territories and stored nut resources. Spring fish runs in coastal rivers attracted populations to intercept migrating shad, alewives, and sturgeon. Summer shellfish harvesting and offshore fishing concentrated activity along shorelines. Fall nut harvests drew populations back to interior forests with productive oak and hickory stands. The lower Hudson River Valley served as a major corridor linking coastal and interior populations. Sites along the Hudson contained mixtures of coastal and interior materials, including marine shell, lithic tools from inland sources, and diverse faunal remains reflecting multiple environmental zones. The river provided anadromous fish runs that concentrated resources predictably in spring and fall. Sturgeon, shad, and striped bass migrations supported substantial human populations at favorable fishing locations. Evidence of fish processing at some sites suggests preservation through drying or smoking for storage. Long Island Sound created a protected estuarine environment distinct from the open Atlantic coast. The Sound's sheltered waters supported productive shellfish beds and provided calmer conditions for watercraft use. Sites along both the Long Island and Connecticut shores of the Sound show intensive shellfish exploitation and fishing. The concentration of sites around the Sound suggests this environment supported higher population densities than exposed Atlantic shorelines or interior upland forests. Salt marsh environments provided diverse resources, including waterfowl, small mammals, fish, and plant materials. Marsh grasses could be harvested for construction or craft production. Tidal creeks concentrated fish during low tide periods. Seasonal waterfowl migrations brought ducks, geese, and other birds to marsh habitats in spring and fall. The dynamic nature of marsh environments required detailed ecological knowledge to exploit effectively. Preservation conditions in coastal shell middens differ substantially from interior sites. Alkaline conditions created by decomposing shell preserve bone and other organic materials that rarely survive in acidic forest soils. This preservation bias creates richer faunal and botanical assemblages from coastal sites compared to inland locations. The apparent dietary diversity at coastal sites may partially reflect better preservation rather than exclusively broader subsistence practices. Comparison between coastal and interior diets remains difficult due to these taphonomic differences. Watercraft technology enabled exploitation of offshore resources and facilitated travel along rivers and coastal waters. Direct evidence of boats remains rare due to poor preservation of wood in most contexts. Dugout canoes were likely produced by controlled burning and scraping of large trees. Bark canoes may have been constructed using techniques documented ethnographically, though no prehistoric examples survive from the region. The sophistication of watercraft can be inferred from evidence of offshore fishing and long-distance water travel, but specific construction techniques remain archaeologically invisible. coastal populations participated in exchange networks that distributed marine resources to interior groups while acquiring lithic materials and other goods from inland sources. Marine shell moved substantial distances into interior New York and beyond. High-quality cherts from interior quarries appear at coastal sites where local lithic resources were limited to glacial cobbles of variable quality. These exchange patterns created economic interdependence between coastal and interior populations. Population estimates for coastal areas remain uncertain, but artifact densities and site frequencies suggest substantial occupation. The concentration of resources in coastal and estuarine zones could support higher population densities than interior forests, where resources distributed more diffusely across the landscape. Seasonal aggregation at coastal locations during periods of resource abundance may have created temporary population concentrations exceeding carrying capacity for year-round occupation. Competition for productive coastal resource zones may have generated territorial boundaries and social mechanisms for regulating access. The investment in shell-midden accumulation at specific locations suggests repeated use by particular groups, possibly claiming rights to those areas. Evidence of conflict remains limited, but skeletal trauma indicators appear occasionally in coastal burial populations. Whether violence resulted from resource competition or other social causes cannot be determined from archaeological evidence alone. The transition from primarily wild resource exploitation to incorporation of cultivated plants affected coastal populations differently than interior groups. Coastal environments offered reliable marine resources that reduced pressure to adopt agriculture. Interior groups facing less predictable terrestrial resources may have adopted cultivation earlier or more intensively. This created divergent trajectories between coastal and interior populations during late prehistoric periods, with coastal groups maintaining stronger emphasis on fishing and shellfish collection, even as agriculture expanded elsewhere. The woodland period in New York extends from approximately 1000 BCE to European contact, marked by introduction of pottery, construction of earthworks, and gradual shifts in subsistence and settlement. Archaeologists subdivide this lengthy period into early, middle, and late woodland phases based on ceramic styles, burial practices, and settlement patterns. The term woodland does not imply forest dwelling exclusively, but rather refers to the broader eastern woodlands cultural area. Populations during this period occupied diverse environmental zones from coast to interior, using varied adaptive strategies. Early woodland manifestations from approximately 1000 BCE to 0 CE show limited changes from terminal late archaic lifeways aside from ceramic adoption. The earliest pottery appears thick-walled with conoidal or pointed bases suited to placement in fires or sandy substrates. Cord marking and fabric impressions decorated vessel exteriors. These early ceramics show similarities to pottery traditions in the Great Lakes region and St. Lawrence Valley, suggesting cultural connections or population movements linking these areas. The functional advantages of pottery over soapstone vessels included lighter weight for transport and easier manufacture from locally available clay sources. Subsistence during the early woodland period continued patterns established in the late Archaic, with hunting, fishing, gathering, and seasonal movements between resource zones. No evidence suggests agriculture or plant cultivation during this phase in New York. Nut processing remained important based on recovery of hickory and acorn shell fragments at sites. Deer constituted the primary game species based on faunal assemblages. Fish remains appear at sites near productive waters. The introduction of pottery did not correlate with fundamental subsistence changes, but rather represented technological addition to existing adaptive strategies. Burial mound construction began during the early woodland period, representing significant labor investment in mortuary ritual. These earthen mounds covered human burials and associated grave goods, Some mounds contained single individuals, while others held multiple interments. The variation in burial treatment suggests social differentiation, though the specific basis for distinctions remains unclear. Grave goods included projectile points, smoking pipes, bone tools, and occasionally exotic materials obtained through trade. The construction of visible burial monuments may indicate territorial claims or commemoration of important individuals. The Meadowood phase represents a well-defined early woodland manifestation in central and western New York. Meadowood sites occur along the Finger Lakes, in the Genesee Valley, and throughout the Lake Ontario plain. Distinctive Meadowood cache blades fashioned from high-quality Onondaga chert appear in mortuary contexts. These thin, finely worked bifaces demonstrate sophisticated flint knapping skill. Some caches contain dozens of blades deposited together, suggesting ceremonial or social functions beyond utilitarian tool use. The restricted distribution of Meadowood materials defines a regional tradition distinct from contemporary manifestations in adjacent areas. Middle Woodland period from approximately 0 to 1000 CE shows increased elaboration of burial practices and expansion of long-distance exchange networks. The Hopewell interaction sphere linked populations across eastern North America through trade in exotic materials and shared symbolic systems. New York populations participated peripherally in Hopewell networks, though the region lacked the elaborate earthwork complexes characteristic of Ohio Valley Hopewell centers. Marine shell, copper, mica, and obsidian from distant sources appear in Middle Woodland burial contexts in New York. Point Peninsula tradition represents the primary Middle Woodland manifestation across much of New York. Point Peninsula pottery shows regional variations in vessel form and decoration. Dentate stamping created geometric designs on vessel exteriors. Some vessels featured collared rims that would become more pronounced in later periods. Settlement patterns during Point Peninsula occupation included small dispersed camps and larger multi-season base camps near productive resource zones. The Kip Island site in the upper Susquehanna drainage contained substantial Point Peninsula occupations with evidence of diverse subsistence activities. Burial mounds continued during the Middle Woodland, with some showing multiple construction episodes and complex internal features. The Clyce site in Onondaga County contained burial mounds with cremations and bundle burials indicating delayed interment and possibly secondary processing of remains. Exotic grave goods in some burials demonstrate participation in long-distance exchange. The concentration of exotic materials with specific individuals suggests social ranking or achieved status recognition through exchange relationships. Subsistence practices during the Middle Woodland remained focused on wild resources with possible incipient cultivation of native seed plants. Chenopodium, amaranth, and squash seeds appear at some Middle Woodland sites, though distinguishing wild from cultivated varieties remains difficult. These plants may represent early horticultural experiments or simply intensive use of wild stands. No evidence indicates maize cultivation during this period in New York. Nut processing, deer hunting, and fishing continued as primary subsistence activities. Smoking pipes appear with increasing frequency during Middle Woodland contexts. These pipes were fashioned from stone, fired clay, or occasionally bone. Pipe forms included simple tubular varieties and more elaborate platform or effigy styles. The presence of pipes indicates tobacco or other plant materials were smoked, though specific plant species cannot be determined from archaeological evidence alone. Pipe smoking may have served medicinal, ceremonial, or social functions. The elaboration of pipe forms suggests symbolic significance beyond purely functional smoking. Population levels during Middle Woodland may have increased compared to early woodland based on site frequencies, though precise estimates remain speculative. Settlement patterns suggest continued seasonal mobility with varying degrees of sedentism at different locations. Some base camps show evidence of extended occupation potentially approaching year-round residents. Other sites represent brief seasonal extraction camps. The range of site types indicates flexible settlement strategies responsive to resource distribution and seasonal availability. Technology during Middle Woodland period shows refinement of existing tool forms rather than fundamental innovations. Projectile points become smaller and lighter, possibly indicating bow and arrow adoption, though this remains debated. Groundstone tools for plant processing continue. Bone tools including awls, needles, and fishhooks appear in assemblages. The diversity of tool types reflects specialized task performance. Some tools show evidence of curation and resharpening, indicating valued implements were maintained over extended use lives. Exchange networks during Middle Woodland connected New York populations to Hopewell centers in the Ohio Valley and other distant regions. The mechanisms of exchange remain unclear, but possibilities include direct procurement during long-distance travel, intergroup trade at aggregation sites, or down-the-line exchange between adjacent groups. Materials moved in multiple directions, with both imports and exports from New York populations. The social contexts of exchange likely involved gift-giving, alliance formation, and prestige competition among leaders. Lithic raw material procurement continued from established quarry locations. Onondaga chert from central New York outcrops provided high-quality material for tool production. This distinctive black-to-gray chert appears at sites across the Northeast, indicating export from source areas. Other lithic materials, including Pennsylvania jaspers and Normanskill chert from the Hudson Valley, also circulated through exchange. The presence of exotic lithics at sites allows tracking of raw material movement patterns and inference of social connections. Climate during the Middle Woodland remained relatively stable, with conditions similar to modern patterns. Minor fluctuations in temperature and precipitation occurred, but did not produce dramatic environmental changes requiring major adaptive shifts. The stability of environmental conditions during this period allowed elaboration of regionally specific cultural traditions adapted to local resource distributions. The lack of climatic stress may have enabled population growth and development of more complex social systems. Regional differentiation became increasingly pronounced during Middle Woodland, with distinct ceramic traditions and settlement patterns in different portions of New York. Coastal populations maintained emphasis on marine resources, while interior groups focused on riverine and forest resources. The Finger Lakes region showed distinctive patterns different from the Hudson Valley or the Lake Ontario plain. This regionalization foreshadows even stronger distinctions that emerge during the subsequent Late Woodland period. The Late Woodland period from approximately 1000 CE to European contact witnessed the most substantial changes in prehistoric New York, including agricultural adoption, population aggregation, and development of regionally distinct cultural patterns. Maize cultivation appears in the archaeological record by approximately 1000 CE, though initial adoption remained limited in scale. By 1300 CE, agricultural production had intensified significantly in many areas, particularly in major river valleys with fertile floodplain soils. The transition to agriculture occurred gradually rather than abruptly, with continued reliance on wild resources alongside cultivated crops. Maize, beans, and squash formed the core agricultural complex, though adoption timing varied for each crop. Maize appears earliest in archaeological contexts, with beans and squash following several centuries later. These crops provided complementary nutritional benefits and could be intercropped in the same fields. Maize offered carbohydrates and could be dried for long-term storage. Beans contributed protein and fixed nitrogen in soils, improving fertility. Squash provided vitamins and minerals, while its broad leaves suppressed weed growth. The agricultural complex required substantial labor investment in field preparation, planting, weeding, and harvesting. Agricultural fields were cleared using slash-and-burn techniques that involved cutting trees, burning vegetation, and planting among stumps and debris. Fields remained productive for several years before soil fertility declined and weed competition increased. Groups then cleared new fields, while allowing old fields to revert to forest. This swidden or shifting cultivation system required access to extensive forest land for field rotation. The labor demands of agriculture influenced settlement patterns, seasonal scheduling, and social organization. Storage of agricultural surplus became increasingly important as reliance on cultivated crops intensified. Below-ground storage pits excavated into subsoil provided cool, stable environments for preserving dried corn, beans, and squash. These pits appear inside and outside habitation structures at late woodland villages. The capacity to store surplus enabled populations to remain sedentary through winter months rather than dispersing into small foraging groups. Storage also created potential for differential accumulation of resources and emergence of social inequality. Village sites dating to the late woodland period show substantial changes from earlier dispersed settlement patterns. Aggregated villages contained multiple longhouse structures arranged in clusters or rows. Some villages housed populations of several hundred individuals based on structure counts and estimated occupancy. Village locations favored elevated terraces near major rivers, providing access to fertile agricultural soils, fresh water, and transportation routes. Defensive considerations also influenced site selection, with many villages occupying naturally defensible positions on hilltops or peninsulas. Longhouses served as residential structures, housing extended family groups. These buildings measured from 15 to over 30 meters in length and 6 to 8 meters in width. Construction employed a wooden post framework covered with bark sheathing. Interior hearths spaced along the central axis provided heat and cooking facilities. Storage pits were excavated into floor surfaces. Multiple families occupied each longhouse in separate compartments along its length. The size of longhouses reflects matrilocal residence patterns, where related women remained together while men joined their wives' households upon marriage. Palisades, or defensive wooden walls, surrounded many late woodland villages. These fortifications consisted of posts set vertically in trenches or individual post holes, forming continuous barriers around settlement perimeters. Some palisades incorporated multiple rows of posts or bastions projecting outward to allow defensive coverage of wall sections. The investment in palisade construction indicates concern with defense and likelihood of intergroup conflict. Rebuilding and repair of palisades at some sites demonstrates sustained defensive needs over extended occupation periods. Evidence of conflict increases substantially during the late woodland period compared to earlier times. Human skeletal remains show increased frequency of trauma, including embedded projectile points, scalping marks, and healed fractures consistent with interpersonal violence. Some village sites show evidence of destruction by burning. Mass burial features containing remains of individuals of all ages and both sexes suggest massacre events. Competition for agricultural land, revenge cycles, and captive-taking for adoption may have motivated conflict, though specific causes remain debated. Ceramic technology during the late woodland shows regional stylistic variations and increasing elaboration of vessel forms. Collared vessels with complex incised, punctate, or cord-wrapped stick decorations characterize late prehistoric pottery in New York. Vessel shapes include globular cooking pots and occasional specialized forms. Regional traditions, including Owasco, Chance, and Oak Hill, Phases each demonstrate distinctive ceramic attributes. These stylistic variations allow archaeologists to trace population movements, interaction spheres, and cultural boundaries across the landscape. The Owasco tradition represents late woodland manifestations in central New York from approximately 1000 to 1300 CE. Owasco sites occur throughout the Finger Lakes region, Mohawk Valley, and upper Susquehanna drainage. Settlement patterns include small hamlets and larger villages. Owasco ceramics feature cord-marked surfaces with incised geometric designs on collared rims. Subsistence evidence indicates mixed economy with maize agriculture, supplemented by hunting, fishing, and gathering. The Owasco tradition appears ancestral to later Iroquoian populations based on cultural continuities in material culture and settlement patterns. Population aggregation intensified after approximately 1300 CE, with villages increasing in size while total site numbers decreased. This nucleation process concentrated populations into fewer, larger settlements. Villages housing 300 to 500 individuals became common in productive agricultural zones. The consolidation may reflect defensive concerns requiring larger cooperative groups for protection. Alternatively, agricultural intensification may have enabled larger permanent settlements by increasing local food production. Both factors likely contributed to nucleation trends. Social organization during the late woodland period involved kinship-based leadership rather than formalized political hierarchy. Village councils composed of elder women and men made decisions affecting the community. Lineage matrons held authority over longhouse groups and influenced selection of male leaders. Achieved status based on personal qualities, including oratory skill, generosity, and leadership in warfare determined influence. No archaeological evidence indicates inherited political offices or permanent status distinctions during this period in New York. Gender roles divided labor with women responsible for agriculture, plant processing, pottery production, and childcare. Men conducted hunting, fishing, warfare, and long-distance trade. This division appears in burial patterns, with males interred with weapons and tools, while females accompanied by ceramic vessels and plant processing implements. The central importance of agriculture elevated women's economic contributions and may have influenced the development of matrilineal kinship systems documented ethnographically among later Iroquoian groups. Trade networks during the late woodland connected New York populations across the Northeast and beyond. Marine shell from Atlantic and Gulf coasts moved inland through exchange. Native copper from Lake Superior sources appears in burial and domestic contexts. Pottery vessels and lithic materials circulated between regions. The volume of exchange appears greater than earlier periods based on quantities of non-local materials at sites. Regular trade relationships created social bonds between communities and facilitated information exchange, alongside material movements. Smoking pipes show increased elaboration during late woodland, with effigy forms depicting animals, humans, and abstract designs. These carved stone and ceramic pipes demonstrate artistic skill and symbolic sophistication. Some pipes accompanied burials as grave goods. Others appear in domestic contexts, suggesting everyday use. The proliferation of elaborate pipe forms indicates tobacco smoking held social and possibly ceremonial importance. Pipe styles show regional variations that correlate with ceramic traditions, suggesting shared symbolic systems within interaction spheres. Subsistence strategies during the late woodland balanced agricultural production with continued wild resource exploitation. Deer hunting remained important for meat and hides. Fall nut harvests provided storable foods complementing agricultural yields. Spring and fall fish runs offered seasonal resource concentrations. The combination of agriculture and wild resources provided dietary diversity and buffered against crop failures. Groups with access to multiple environmental zones maintained broader subsistence bases than those restricted to single environments. Settlement patterns during the late prehistoric period reflect increasing complexity in community organization and land use strategies. Village locations shifted periodically as agricultural fields depleted soil nutrients and firewood supplies near settlements became exhausted. Relocation occurred at intervals ranging from 10 to 30 years, based on archaeological evidence of sequential occupations in different locations. New village sites were established within territories claimed by particular groups, maintaining access to familiar resource zones while allowing previously used areas to regenerate. The spatial organization within villages shows deliberate planning rather than random structure placement. Longhouses aligned in rows or organized around central plazas suggest community-level decisions about settlement layout. Open areas within villages likely served as communal workspaces, ceremonial grounds, or gathering places. The regular spacing between structures indicates concern with fire prevention and possibly social conventions about appropriate distances between family dwellings. Refuse disposal patterns show designated midden areas outside residential zones. Satellite camps distributed around major villages served specialized functions, including hunting camps, fishing stations, and agricultural field houses. These smaller sites show brief occupations and limited artifact assemblages focused on particular activities. Hunters established temporary camps in upland territories during fall deer hunting seasons. Fishing camps near productive locations operated during spring and fall fish runs. Field houses near distant agricultural plots allowed workers to remain at fields during planting and harvest periods without returning daily to main villages. Mortuary practices during the late prehistoric period varied regionally, but generally involved burial within or near village areas. Individual interments in flexed positions placed in circular or oval pits represent common burial treatment. Grave goods accompanied some burials, including ceramic vessels, pipes, tools, and ornaments. The quantity and quality of grave goods varied between individuals, though distinctions appear modest compared to hierarchical societies elsewhere. Infants and children received burial treatment similar to adults, indicating cultural valuation of all community members regardless of age. Ossuaries or mass burial features containing disarticulated remains of multiple individuals appear at some late prehistoric sites. These features resulted from secondary burial practices, where bodies were initially placed elsewhere, then later exhumed and reburied collectively. Ossuary burial may have occurred during village relocation, when populations transported remains of deceased community members to new settlement locations. This practice maintained connections to ancestors while physically moving across the landscape. Bone tools increased in diversity and sophistication during late prehistoric periods. Antler was fashioned into projectile points, handles, and flaking tools for stoneworking. Bone awls, needles, and pins served leather working and textile production. Fishhooks, harpoons, and gorges enabled specialized fishing techniques. Gaming pieces carved from bone suggest recreational activities. The range of bone tool forms indicates specialized craft production and technological knowledge of material properties. Shell bead production intensified during the late prehistoric period, with increasing standardization of forms and manufacturing techniques. Disc beads cut from marine shell required drilling central perforations using stone or bone drills. Cylindrical beads were cut from whelk shell columella and ground to uniform dimensions. The labor investment in bead production was substantial, with skilled artisans producing beads more efficiently than novices. Beads served as personal ornaments, gift exchange items, and possibly proto-currency in some contexts. Wampum production using purple and white shell beads became increasingly important in the centuries immediately before European contact. These cylindrical beads were strung in patterns creating belts and strings with mnemonic and diplomatic functions. The production techniques required specialized tools and considerable skill. Purple beads made from quahog shell held higher value than white beads from whelk shell due to the limited purple portions of quahog shells. Wampum served social and political functions beyond simple ornament. Lithic technology during the late prehistoric period emphasized production of small triangular projectile points suitable for arrow tips. The bow and arrow had replaced the atlatl and dart as primary hunting weapon by this time. Stone tools also included small drills, scrapers, and knives. Ground stone tools for plant processing remained important, with mortars, pestles, grinding stones, and hammerstones common at village sites. The reduction in investment in elaborate stone tools compared to earlier periods may reflect shifting technological priorities toward wood, bone, and fiber implements. Woodworking technology employed ground stone axes, adzes, and gouges to fell trees, hollow logs, and shape wooden objects. Dugout canoes were manufactured by controlled burning and scraping of large logs. Wooden bowls, ladles, and other containers served domestic functions. Wooden structural elements, including posts, rafters, and bark sheathing, required substantial processing. The archaeological invisibility of wooden artifacts due to poor preservation underestimates the importance of wood technology in daily life. Fiber technology produced cordage, nets, bags, and textiles from plant materials and animal sinews. Indirect evidence includes cord-marked pottery, suggesting rope or cord production. Net weights indicate fishing nets. Bone needles suggest sewing or weaving activities. The range of tasks requiring cordage and textiles implies sophisticated fiber processing knowledge. Specific plants used for fiber production likely included basswood bark, milkweed, and nettle, based on later ethnographic documentation. Seasonal scheduling coordinated subsistence activities across the annual cycle. Spring involved field preparation, planting, and exploitation of fish runs and emerging plant greens. Summer required field maintenance, including weeding and protection from animal pests. Late summer and fall focused on harvest of agricultural crops, nut collection, and intensive hunting. Winter involved living on stored foods, hunting, and craft production. The agricultural calendar imposed structure on yearly activities, while wild resource exploitation filled gaps in agricultural productivity. Labor organization within villages involved task specialization by age and gender. Women conducted agricultural labor collectively, working cooperatively in field preparation, planting, and harvesting. Men organized hunting parties, coordinating pursuit of deer and other game. Fishing efforts involved both individual and group activities, depending on technique and target species. Elderly individuals contributed through craft production, child supervision, and knowledge transmission. Children assisted with age-appropriate tasks including bird scaring in fields and gathering activities. Social mechanisms maintained cooperation and reduced conflict within villages. Kinship obligations created mutual support networks. Reciprocal exchange of labor and resources built social bonds. Public recognition of generous individuals encouraged sharing. Conflict resolution involved mediation by respected elders rather than coercive authority. The absence of formal political hierarchy required consensus building and persuasion rather than command. These mechanisms enabled large villages to function without centralized political control. Political relationships between villages involved both cooperation and competition. Allied villages coordinated defense against common enemies. Inter-village marriages created kinship links across communities. Trade relationships distributed resources between regions with different environmental characteristics. Conversely, competition over territory, resources, and prestige generated conflicts between groups. Raiding and warfare served multiple functions, including revenge, captive acquisition, and demonstration of martial prowess. Territory claims by particular groups appear to have been recognized by neighbors based on village distributions and buffer zones between settlement clusters. Core territories around major villages contained agricultural fields, hunting grounds, and resource extraction areas. Peripheral zones between territories saw contested use or served as neutral hunting grounds. The defense of territory through palisade construction and village placement on defensible locations indicates territorial boundaries mattered sufficiently to warrant protection. Exchange systems during late prehistoric periods facilitated movement of materials, objects, and information across extensive geographic areas. Trade networks connected populations in New York to groups throughout the Northeast, Great Lakes region, and beyond. The archaeological evidence of exchange includes raw materials from distant sources, finished objects manufactured elsewhere, and stylistic influences in ceramic decoration and other material culture. Exchange served economic functions by distributing resources unevenly distributed across landscapes, while also fulfilling social and political roles in alliance formation and prestige competition. Marine shell from Atlantic coastal sources moved inland through multiple mechanisms. Direct procurement by interior groups traveling to coast remained possible, though costly in time and effort. More commonly, shell likely passed through sequential exchanges between neighboring groups in down-the-line trade patterns. Coastal populations acquired interior resources, including high-quality lithic materials and possibly agricultural products in return for shell. The volume of shell reaching interior sites varied with distance from source areas, showing general decline in quantities with increasing distance, though some sites far from coasts contained substantial shell assemblages. Copper from Lake Superior sources appears in New York archaeological contexts throughout the prehistoric sequence, but increases in frequency during late periods. Native copper required no smelting and could be cold-worked into tools, ornaments, and ceremonial objects. Copper items found in New York include beads, pendants, gorgets, and occasional tool forms. The presence of copper manufacturing debris at some sites indicates local working of raw material rather than exclusive import of finished objects. Copper held special significance beyond utilitarian value, based on its distinctive color, malleability, and exotic origin. Lithic raw materials circulated through trade networks with distinctive stone types moving hundreds of kilometers from source areas. Onondaga chert from central New York appeared at sites throughout the Northeast. Pennsylvania jaspers moved into New York from southern sources. Norman skill chert from Hudson Valley outcrops distributed across the region. Knife River flint from North Dakota occasionally appears in eastern sites, though whether through direct long-distance exchange or sequential movements remains unclear. The distribution patterns of lithic materials allow reconstruction of interaction networks and identification of exchange partners. Ceramic vessels occasionally moved between regions, though pottery generally shows local manufacture from clay sources near habitation sites. Stylistic influences in ceramic decoration spread more readily than finished vessels, indicating information exchange and possibly movement of potters between communities through marriage or adoption. Some ceramic forms show hybrid characteristics combining stylistic elements from different traditions, suggesting interaction between populations with distinct manufacturing conventions. The transmission of ceramic styles may have occurred during inter-village gatherings through trade contacts or via population movements. Perishable goods likely constituted major components of exchange systems, though archaeological visibility remains minimal. Foodstuffs including dried corn, nuts, and processed meat could be transported and traded. Furs and hides provided valuable exchange commodities. Tobacco held significance for ceremonial and social purposes. Wooden objects, fiber textiles, and other organic materials probably circulated, but rarely preserve archaeologically. The emphasis on durable goods in archaeological exchange studies likely underestimates the volume and diversity of actual trade. Gift exchange served social and political functions distinct from economic trade. Leaders exchanged gifts to establish alliances, demonstrate generosity, and create obligations of reciprocity. Elaborate objects including decorated pipes, copper ornaments, and shell beads served as appropriate gifts for political purposes. The value of gifts resided partially in exotic origin and labor investment in manufacture. Reciprocal gift-giving created ongoing relationships between leaders and communities, facilitating cooperation and mutual support. Regional exchange networks created spheres of interaction defined by shared material culture styles and regular trade contacts. The geographic extent of particular ceramic traditions partially reflects interaction spheres where populations maintained regular contact. Groups within interaction spheres shared information, intermarried, and coordinated activities, including ceremonial gatherings and military alliances. Boundaries between interaction spheres appeared permeable, with some communities participating in multiple networks or serving as intermediaries between regions. Trade gatherings or fairs may have occurred at specific locations and times, though direct archaeological evidence remains limited. Ethnographic documentation from early contact periods describes large gatherings where multiple communities assembled for trade, ceremony, and social interaction. These gatherings facilitated exchange of bulk goods, arrangement of marriages, and political negotiations. The archaeological signature of such gatherings might include unusual concentrations of exotic materials or evidence of large temporary encampments, though identifying such sites remains challenging. Monopolization of particular resources or trade routes provided economic and political advantages to groups controlling access. Communities located near high-quality lithic sources could regulate extraction and distribution. Populations controlling transportation corridors along major rivers influenced movement of goods and people. Coastal groups served as gatekeepers for marine shell distribution to interior populations. These strategic positions allowed accumulation of wealth and influence, though no evidence suggests formal taxation or tribute systems during prehistoric periods in New York. Craft specialization increased during late prehistoric periods, with some individuals demonstrating superior skill in particular manufacturing activities. Skilled stoneworkers produced finely crafted projectile points and tools. Expert potters created vessels with elaborate decorations and consistent forms. Bead makers achieved standardization in shell bead production. Whether these specialists practiced full-time craft production or combined specialized skills with general subsistence activities remains unclear. Part-time specialization, where skilled individuals produced surplus goods for exchange, while also participating in farming and other subsistence work, appears most likely. Exchange relationships created dependencies between communities with different resource bases. Interior agricultural populations required marine shell for bead production and possibly fish for dietary diversity. Coastal groups needed high-quality stone for tool manufacture and potentially agricultural products during resource shortfalls. These complementary needs encouraged stable exchange partnerships over extended periods. Disruption of exchange relationships through conflict or environmental change would have created economic stress, requiring alternative procurement strategies. Information exchange accompanied material trade with knowledge spreading through contact networks. Agricultural techniques, ceramic manufacturing methods, and religious concepts diffused between regions through trade contacts and population movements. Innovations in one area could spread rapidly across interaction networks or might remain localized depending on receptivity of neighboring populations and adaptive advantage of new practices. The archaeological visibility of information exchange remains indirect, inferred from appearance of new cultural traits in regions previously lacking them. Warfare and conflict influence trade patterns by creating hostile relationships, preventing exchange, or by generating demands for weapons and defensive preparations. Populations at war disrupted each other's trade routes and targeted exchange partners of enemies. Conversely, military alliances facilitated preferential trade relationships between allied groups. Captives taken in warfare were adopted into victor communities, potentially bringing knowledge of exchange networks and manufacturing techniques from their origin groups. The complex relationship between conflict and trade created dynamic patterns of cooperation and competition. Cultural boundaries partially corresponded with limits of regular exchange interaction. Groups separated by language differences, hostile relationships, or geographic barriers participated less in mutual exchange. However, cultural boundaries remained permeable, with some degree of exchange occurring even between groups with limited regular contact. Exotic materials from very distant sources reached New York through long-distance exchange chains crossing multiple cultural boundaries. The mechanisms enabling such long-distance exchange likely involved specialized trading relationships or passed through many intermediate exchanges. Social complexity during late prehistoric periods in New York manifested through multiple indicators, including settlement hierarchy, mortuary differentiation, evidence of organized conflict, and specialized craft production. The degree of social complexity remained modest compared to hierarchical chiefdoms documented elsewhere in eastern North America. Leadership operated through achieved status and persuasive influence rather than inherited authority or coercive power. Kin-based organization structured social relationships with lineages and clans, forming primary identity groups within larger communities. Warfare intensified during late prehistoric centuries, based on increased skeletal trauma, defensive fortifications, and village destruction episodes. Combat involved raiding parties attacking enemy villages to kill opponents, take captives, and destroy resources. Palisaded villages provided defense against raids, though determined attackers could breach fortifications through fire or sustained assault. Some villages show evidence of hasty abandonment or destruction by burning. Mass burial features containing remains of individuals killed simultaneously suggest successful attacks overwhelming defensive capabilities. Captive taking served multiple functions in warfare practices. Captives could be adopted into victor communities to replace population losses from disease, conflict, or other causes. Adoption involved incorporation into kinship networks with captives, assuming identity of deceased individuals they replaced. Some captives faced ritual torture and execution, though archaeological evidence of such practices remains limited to occasional skeletal modifications. The treatment of captives varied based on age, gender, and circumstances of capture. Women and children faced higher likelihood of adoption, while male warriors risked execution. Scalping practices appear in archaeological contexts through distinctive cut marks on crania indicating removal of scalp tissue. Scalps served as war trophies, demonstrating martial success. The practice held symbolic significance related to concepts of spiritual power and defeat of enemies. Scalping occurred both on battlefield dead and on living captives. Archaeological evidence shows scalping occurred throughout late prehistoric periods, though frequency and specific practices varied regionally and temporally. The symbolic meanings attributed to scalps cannot be fully reconstructed from material evidence alone. Burial practices provide evidence of social differentiation, though distinctions appear modest. Most burials received similar treatment, with interment in flexed position, accompanied by ceramic vessels and occasional other grave goods. Some individuals received more elaborate grave goods, including multiple vessels, pipes, exotic materials, and ornamental items. Whether these distinctions reflect achieved status during life, circumstances of death, or decisions by survivors remains debated. Age and gender influenced burial treatment, with infants sometimes receiving special consideration and adult males more commonly accompanied by weaponry. The absence of monumental architecture, rich burial complexes, or other markers of institutionalized hierarchy indicates social organization remained relatively egalitarian. Leadership positions existed but operated through consensus and persuasion rather than command authority. Village councils made community decisions with participation from multiple individuals rather than single rulers. Lineage elders, successful warriors, and skilled orators could influence decisions, but lacked coercive mechanisms to impose will on others. This political organization required constant negotiation and coalition building to accomplish collective goals. Evidence of ritual specialists or shamans appears indirectly through specialized artifacts and possible ritual contexts. Elaborate pipes, unusual artifacts interpreted as ceremonial objects, and occasional burials with distinctive assemblages suggest some individuals held religious or healing roles. Shamans or medicine people would have treated illness, conducted rituals, and mediated between human and spiritual realms. The archaeological visibility of such roles remains limited, since many ritual activities would have involved perishable materials and behaviors, leaving minimal material traces. Conflict resolution within communities involved mediation, compensation payments, and appeals to kinship obligations. Disputes between individuals or families required resolution to prevent escalation into violence, threatening community cohesion. Respected elders or councils mediated conflicts, seeking solutions acceptable to disputing parties. Compensation for injuries or deaths might involve transfer of goods, provision of labor, or symbolic gestures of reconciliation. The effectiveness of these mechanisms varied, and some disputes resulted in blood feuds extending across generations. Inter-community conflicts generated cycles of revenge raiding, where attacks provoked retaliatory raids in ongoing violence. These cycles could persist for years or generations, draining community resources and causing population losses. Peacemaking efforts involved negotiations between leaders, exchange of gifts, and sometimes arranged marriages, creating kinship ties between formerly hostile groups. The fragility of peace agreements meant violence could resume following incidents or when political situations changed. The archaeological record of conflict episodes provides limited insight into specific causes or resolution of particular conflicts. Military organization involved war parties led by successful warriors with established reputations. Participation in raids remained voluntary, though social pressure encouraged men to demonstrate courage and skill in combat. War leaders gained influence through success in battle, but lacked permanent authority outside military contexts. Young men sought opportunities to participate in warfare to establish reputations and gain status. The risks of combat, including death, injury, and capture, balanced against social rewards of successful martial performance. Defensive strategies evolved to counter raiding tactics. Palisade construction represented major labor investment, requiring coordination of multiple families or entire villages. Some palisades incorporated sophisticated defensive features, including multiple wall rows, bastions, and protected entryways. Village placement on hilltops, peninsulas, or locations with natural defensive advantages enhanced security. Lookout posts warned of approaching enemies, allowing defenders to prepare or evacuate non-combatants. Despite defensive measures, determined attackers could overcome fortifications through fire, siege, or surprise assault. Trophy-taking beyond scalps may have included other body parts, though archaeological preservation limits evidence. Some skeletal remains show unusual modifications, suggesting ritual treatment or trophy processing. The symbolic significance of trophies related to concepts of spiritual power, defeat of enemies, and demonstration of martial prowess. Display of trophies within communities served to intimidate opponents and encourage warriors. The specific meanings attributed to different trophy types varied culturally and cannot be fully reconstructed from archaeological evidence alone. Alliance formation between villages created larger political units capable of coordinated military action. Allied villages provided mutual defense, coordinated attacks on common enemies, and shared information about threats. These alliances could involve formal agreements symbolized through exchange of wampum belts or other ceremonial objects. Alliance systems remained flexible, with relationships shifting based on changing political circumstances. The size and stability of alliance systems influenced regional power dynamics and capacity of communities to resist aggression. Population aggregation into larger villages during late prehistoric periods may have resulted partially from defensive concerns. Larger communities could mobilize more warriors and construct more substantial fortifications than small scattered settlements. Aggregation required resolution of potential conflicts arising from concentration of previously separate groups. The formation of larger villages involved negotiation of political relationships, resource access, and social integration of distinct family groups into cohesive communities. Gender roles in warfare appear to have been predominantly male, based on association of weapons with male burials and ethnographic documentation. Women participated in warfare indirectly through production of food, weapons, and other supplies supporting military expeditions. Women also influenced decisions about warfare through roles in councils and as family leaders. Elderly women sometimes appear in historical accounts as influential voices, arguing for or against military actions. The specific roles of women in warfare varied and cannot be fully determined from archaeological evidence. The impacts of warfare on late prehistoric populations included direct mortality from combat, disruption of subsistence activities, destruction of stored foods and villages, and psychological trauma affecting survivors. Population losses from warfare combined with disease and other mortality factors to influence demographic patterns. Communities suffering severe losses faced challenges maintaining viability and might merge with allied groups or relocate to more defensible positions. The cumulative effects of sustained conflict shaped settlement distributions and political relationships across regions. The late prehistoric period from approximately 1300 CE to European contact witnessed continued population growth and cultural elaboration in many areas of New York. Village sizes increased, with some settlements housing 500 or more individuals based on longhouse counts and spatial extent of occupation areas. The concentration of populations into fewer, larger villages continued trends initiated earlier, creating nucleated settlement patterns in productive agricultural zones. Depopulated buffer zones between hostile groups expanded as villages consolidated, leaving portions of landscape unoccupied except for seasonal hunting and resource extraction. Agricultural intensification accompanied population growth as communities increased field sizes and expanded cultivation into previously unexploited areas. Maize varieties adapted to shorter growing seasons allowed agricultural expansion into northern portions of the region previously marginal for cultivation. Bean cultivation became more prevalent during this period, appearing with increasing frequency in archaeobotanical assemblages. The complete Three Sisters agricultural complex of maize, beans, and squash provided nutritional complementarity supporting larger populations than single crop systems. Storage capacity expanded dramatically during late centuries before contact. Villages contained hundreds of storage pits, providing capacity for tons of dried corn and other preserved foods. Individual longhouses had multiple storage features, both interior and exterior. The ability to accumulate and store agricultural surplus created potential for status differentiation based on differential access to stored resources. Control over surplus distribution may have enhanced influence of particular families or lineages, though no evidence indicates formalized economic hierarchy. Population estimates for late prehistoric New York remain uncertain, but suggest substantial numbers. Some researchers propose populations of 20,000 to 30,000 individuals across the region at contact based on early historical accounts and village site distributions. Others suggest higher estimates of 50,000 or more. These numbers represent significant populations supported by intensive agricultural production, supplemented by wild resource exploitation. Population densities varied regionally, with highest concentrations in major river valleys with optimal agricultural conditions. Ceramic production during final prehistoric centuries achieved high levels of standardization and elaboration. Vessel forms became increasingly consistent, with well-defined rim profiles, collar heights, and body shapes. Decorative motifs showed regional variations reflecting distinct cultural traditions. The consistency of ceramic production suggests standardized manufacturing knowledge transmitted through apprenticeship or family teaching. Some vessels demonstrate exceptional artistic skill with intricate geometric designs covering entire collar surfaces. Regional cultural patterns became increasingly distinct during final prehistoric centuries. The Iroquoian cultural tradition dominated central and western New York, characterized by specific ceramic styles, settlement patterns, and material culture. Algonquian populations occupied coastal areas of Long Island and portions of the lower Hudson Valley, showing different material culture and subsistence adaptations. The boundaries between cultural areas remained permeable with evidence of interaction and exchange across cultural frontiers. These late prehistoric patterns correspond generally with ethnic and linguistic distributions documented during early European contact. The Mohawk Valley emerged as a major population center during late prehistoric times. Large villages lined the valley floor and adjacent terraces, exploiting fertile alluvial soils for intensive agriculture. The concentration of population in this valley reflected optimal environmental conditions, combining agricultural productivity, access to freshwater, and strategic location for trade and communication. Defensive concerns also influenced settlement, as villages could coordinate defense and provide mutual support against enemies. The Mohawk Valley populations maintained distinct ceramic traditions and settlement patterns, differing from neighboring areas. The Finger Lakes region contained substantial late prehistoric populations distributed among multiple villages. These communities exploited both agricultural lands and lake resources, including fishing and waterfowl hunting. Villages occupied defensive positions on hilltops and ridges overlooking lakes and agricultural fields. The region's population participated in regional interaction networks while maintaining distinctive material culture traditions. Competition between villages in the region generated conflicts requiring fortification and alliance formation. Hudson Valley populations showed cultural influences from multiple directions, including connections to coastal groups, interior Iroquoian populations, and southern traditions. The valley served as major transportation corridor facilitating movement of people and goods. Archaeological assemblages reflect this intermediary position, with material culture showing hybrid characteristics. Population densities in the Hudson Valley appear lower than optimal agricultural zones further west, possibly reflecting environmental constraints or political factors. Long Island populations during late prehistoric period maintained distinct coastal adaptations while incorporating agricultural practices. Maize agriculture supplemented continued emphasis on marine resources and shellfish exploitation. Settlement patterns included both dispersed seasonal camps and nucleated villages. Long Island populations participated in exchange networks providing marine shell to interior groups while acquiring lithic materials and other goods. The cultural patterns documented archaeologically on Long Island show connections to coastal Algonquian traditions extending into southern New England. Trade intensified during final prehistoric centuries, with increased volumes of exotic materials reaching sites and expanded geographic range of exchange networks. Wampum production increased substantially during this period, creating standardized shell bead currency used in diplomatic and economic exchanges. The production centers for wampum appear concentrated in coastal areas with access to whelk and quahog shell sources. Finished wampum moved inland through trade, becoming increasingly important in political and ceremonial contexts. Ceremonial elaboration during late prehistoric period appears in increased diversity of pipes, ornaments, and possible ritual artifacts. Some sites contained features interpreted as ceremonial structures or open areas used for communal gatherings. The archaeological evidence for ceremonial practices remains limited to durable artifacts and spatial patterns, since rituals involving perishable materials, songs, and oral traditions leave minimal material traces. The importance of ceremony in social and political life can be inferred from ethnographic documentation, though specific prehistoric practices remain uncertain. Technological innovations during final prehistoric centuries included refinements in existing technologies rather than fundamental new inventions. Pottery manufacturing achieved high technical and artistic standards. Agricultural tools adapted to intensive cultivation demands. Woodworking tools enabled construction of large longhouses and palisades. Hunting technology emphasized small arrow points suitable for bow use. The sophistication of technological systems indicates accumulated knowledge refined over generations and transmitted through teaching and observation. Environmental conditions during late prehistoric centuries remained generally stable with climate similar to modern patterns. Minor fluctuations in temperature and precipitation occurred, but did not generate catastrophic changes requiring major adaptive shifts. The stability of environmental conditions allowed sustained agricultural production and population growth. Local environmental degradation around large villages resulted from deforestation for fields and firewood, contributing to periodic village relocations. Social tensions within large villages may have increased as populations aggregated into concentrated settlements. Competition for leadership positions, disputes over resource access, and conflicts between lineages required constant management to prevent community fragmentation. The mechanisms maintaining village cohesion included kinship obligations, ceremonial practices reinforcing group identity, and external threats encouraging cooperation. Some villages eventually fissioned with portions of population relocating to establish new settlements. The emergence of multi-village political confederacies may have begun during late prehistoric period, though evidence remains debated. Some researchers interpret patterns of ceramic similarity, coordinated village placement, and shared defensive systems as indicating political alliances beyond individual villages. Others argue that confederacy formation occurred only after European contact, in response to new political and economic pressures. The archaeological record cannot definitively resolve timing of large-scale political organization, though precursor patterns of cooperation and alliance existed prehistorically. Cultural continuity from late prehistoric populations to historically documented groups appears strong in some areas. The Iroquoian populations documented during early contact periods show material culture, settlement patterns, and subsistence practices continuous with late prehistoric archaeological patterns. This continuity allows limited use of ethnographic documentation to interpret prehistoric lifeways, though caution remains necessary since contact period changes occurred rapidly. The degree of cultural continuity varies regionally, with some areas showing more dramatic disruptions than others. European contact beginning in the early 1500s initiated transformations that would fundamentally alter indigenous populations in New York. Initial contacts involved fishing vessels along Atlantic coasts and exploratory expeditions penetrating coastal and riverine areas. These early encounters introduced European trade goods, including metal tools, glass beads, and cloth that appear in archaeological contexts dating to the early contact period. The appearance of European materials in indigenous sites marks the transition from prehistoric to protohistoric periods. Though indigenous populations maintained cultural practices and social organization initially unchanged by limited contact. Population estimates at the moment of sustained European contact remain debated but indicate substantial indigenous populations across New York. Early European observers provided population estimates, though these accounts vary in reliability and precision. Some estimates suggest 25,000 or more individuals in the region at contact, though higher and lower numbers appear in different sources. Population distributions concentrated in major river valleys and coastal areas where agricultural productivity and resource abundance supported dense settlements. Interior upland areas and heavily forested zones maintained lower population densities. Disease introduction accompanied European contact with catastrophic demographic consequences. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and other infectious diseases to which indigenous populations lacked immunity spread rapidly through communities. Epidemic episodes killed substantial percentages of affected populations, with mortality rates sometimes exceeding 50% during severe outbreaks. Disease spread ahead of direct European contact through indigenous trade networks, meaning some communities experienced demographic collapse before encountering Europeans directly. The psychological and social impacts of repeated epidemic episodes disrupted traditional practices and social structures. The timing of initial disease impacts remains uncertain, but epidemics likely occurred within decades of first European presence in northeastern North America. Archaeological evidence of demographic decline appears in abandonment of villages, reduction in site sizes, and changes in settlement patterns during early contact period. Burial patterns show increased mortality with mass graves and unusual burial treatments, possibly reflecting epidemic deaths overwhelming normal mortuary practices. The scale of population loss remains difficult to quantify. Precisely but scholarly consensus indicates severe demographic decline during the 16th and 17th centuries. Trade relationships with Europeans developed rapidly as indigenous populations sought metal tools, weapons, and other manufactured goods. European traders desired furs, particularly beaver pelts, creating economic incentives transforming indigenous subsistence and social practices. The fur trade redirected labor from agricultural production and traditional hunting toward intensive trapping. Competition for access to fur resources and European trade goods generated conflicts between indigenous groups and shifted political alliances. Archaeological evidence of early trade includes European artifacts in indigenous contexts and changes in settlement locations to access trade routes. Metal tools, including axes, knives, and awls, replaced stone equivalents rapidly due to functional superiority in cutting and durability. Indigenous populations adapted metal tools to traditional tasks while also modifying work practices to exploit metal tool capabilities. Stone tool production declined precipitously during early contact period as metal became available. However, some stone tool types persisted for specific functions or in contexts where metal remained unavailable. The adoption of metal tools represents one of most immediate and visible changes in material culture during contact period. Glass beads obtained through trade replaced shell beads for some ornamental purposes, though wampum production continued and actually intensified during contact period. European demand for wampum as trade currency encouraged increased production and standardization. Glass beads appear in burial contexts and as ornaments on clothing and objects. The diversity of bead colors, sizes, and forms allowed stylistic expressions and social signaling. Bead types changed over time, allowing archaeologists to date sites and contexts based on bead characteristics. Settlement disruptions occurred as populations relocated to access trade, fled epidemic outbreaks, or sought protection from hostile neighbors strengthened by European alliances. Traditional village locations shifted, with some areas abandoned entirely, while previously marginal zones saw new settlement. The destabilization of settlement patterns disrupted agricultural systems, territorial claims, and social relationships. Some communities merged with neighbors following population losses, while others fragmented as survivors dispersed to join different groups. Political relationships among indigenous groups transformed rapidly during early contact period. Competition for European trade access created new alliance patterns and hostilities. European colonial powers manipulated indigenous conflicts to advance territorial and economic interests. Indigenous leaders navigated complex political landscapes, balancing traditional relationships, new opportunities through European trade, and threats from disease and warfare. The political sophistication required to manage these challenges drew on existing diplomatic traditions while adapting to unprecedented circumstances. Missionary activities beginning in the early 17th century introduced Christianity and challenged traditional religious practices. Some indigenous individuals and communities adopted Christian beliefs, while others resisted or maintained traditional practices alongside superficial Christian acceptance. Religious change intersected with social disruption from disease and trade, creating complex patterns of cultural persistence and transformation. Archaeological evidence of religious change appears in burial practices, abandonment of traditional ceremonial objects, and adoption of Christian symbols. Agricultural practices continued during early contact period, though disease mortality reduced labor forces and trade opportunities redirected effort toward fur procurement. Traditional crops of maize, beans, and squash remained dietary staples, though European crops, including wheat and domesticated animals, were gradually introduced. The balance between agricultural production and wild resource exploitation shifted as populations adapted to changing circumstances. Some communities intensified agriculture, while others increased hunting and gathering as demographic and economic conditions changed. Alcohol introduced through trade created social problems, including addiction, violence, and disruption of community cohesion. European traders used alcohol strategically to facilitate trade and manipulation of indigenous populations. Traditional social mechanisms for managing intoxication proved inadequate for distilled alcohol's potency and availability. The destructive impacts of alcohol abuse appeared quickly during early contact and persisted as ongoing problems. Archaeological evidence of alcohol consumption appears indirectly through trade records and historical accounts rather than material remains. Warfare intensified during contact period as European weapons, including firearms, altered military capabilities, and economic competition increased stakes of conflict. Indigenous groups allied with different European powers fought proxy wars serving colonial interests while pursuing traditional objectives. Captive-taking continued, but meanings changed as captives could be traded to Europeans as slaves. Traditional warfare practices adapted to new technologies and political circumstances while maintaining cultural significance as demonstration of courage and source of prestige. The collapse of indigenous populations through disease created depopulated landscapes that Europeans perceived as wilderness. Areas that had supported substantial populations and intensive agriculture reverted to forest as fewer people remained to maintain clearings and settlements. European colonists occupied these lands, claiming them as unused territory. Despite recent indigenous occupation, the demographic catastrophe enabled European colonization by reducing indigenous populations unable to resist encroachment effectively. Cultural persistence amid transformation characterized indigenous responses to contact. Traditional social structures, including kinship systems and leadership patterns, adapted rather than disappearing entirely. Material culture combined traditional forms with European materials and new hybrid objects. Subsistence practices maintained hunting, fishing, and agriculture while incorporating new technologies and resources. Language, oral traditions, and cultural identities persisted, though modified by contact experiences. The resilience of indigenous populations, despite catastrophic challenges, demonstrates adaptive capacity and cultural vitality. Archaeological investigation of contact period sites provides material evidence complementing documentary sources. European artifacts in indigenous contexts document trade relationships and chronology. Changes in settlement patterns and material culture reflect social and economic transformations. Burial populations show disease impacts and cultural transitions. The integration of archaeological and historical evidence creates fuller understanding of contact period than either source alone. However, gaps and uncertainties remain as many aspects of contact experience left limited material traces or occurred in poorly documented contexts. The end of the prehistoric period in New York cannot be assigned to a single date, but rather represents gradual transition occurring over decades as European contact intensified and indigenous populations experienced cumulative impacts of disease, trade, warfare, and colonization. By the mid-17th century, the region's indigenous populations had been fundamentally transformed from their prehistoric condition. Traditional lifeways persisted in modified forms, but the autonomous development of indigenous cultures characteristic of prehistoric millennia had ended. The archaeological record of prehistoric New York terminates not with a definitive conclusion, but with transformation into new historical circumstances shaped by forces originating beyond the region.